Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to let you know we're still waiting for a couple of task force members to get on, so we're going to give them another 2 to 3 minutes here. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome to our second Digital Transparency Task Force meeting via Zoom. Thank you all for being here. We'll begin. Ms. Linker, can you please call the roll?
Brian Brokaw. Rena Davis.
Here.
Gail Kaufman. Thad Kauser.
Here.
Amber Maltby.
Here.
James Schwab.
Here.
Jenny Wagner.
Here.
And Katie Zoglin.
Here.
Abby Wood.
Here.
Commissioner Hayward.
Here.
And Chair Matich.
Here. All right, item number 1, public comment for items not on the agenda. Do you have any public comment either on the phone line or digitally for items not on our agenda today?
It's unmuted, so.
All right. We did, I hope all the commissioners saw, we did receive 3 public comment letters prior to our meeting. And we just received a digital public comment reminding us that one of those came from Ian Vandewalker from the Brennan Center. So hearing no other public comment for items not on our agenda, proceed to item number 2. This is approval of the April 2020 meeting minutes. Do any task force members have any edits or changes to the meeting minutes? Hearing and seeing none, we will go ahead and, Ms. Linker, would you call the vote? We're just going to do a roll call vote on this one rather than a oral vote. So all those in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Approval unanimous. All right, moving on to item number 3. This is our discussion of the Digital Political Advertisement Archive. For this item, I thought it would be useful to maybe begin by asking commissioners or task force members if they have any comments or observations from the numerous presentations that we had at our first meeting, and maybe use this as an opportunity so folks can kind of, let's get your reaction to that, and then we can march through each one of these questions following that. Does anybody have any comments or observations about the presentations we saw at the first meeting?
This is Jennifer Wagner with the League of Women Voters. I appreciated getting to see very specific examples. I was a little disappointed that Los Angeles didn't focus on digital, really. They showed us a lot of traditional physical content. And so I'd really like to see better representation of different ways that digital political ads are represented. And in particular, as we get into new platforms like apps, I think the samples of what could be uploaded and how would be really interesting to learn a little bit more about. But, you know, small.
Thank you. The other task force members have comments, observations?
Sure. Hi, this is Thad Kauser. I thought it was very helpful. I thought, especially the legal issues and the legal challenges, and I think, you know, everyone agrees on the need to create a very legally defensible, ironclad process going forward. I think to that question, one thing that I'd just like to spotlight now, but hopefully we could get into, I don't know if this meeting is the right time or later, but what's the underlying rationale for creating an archive? I think that was something that was left unsaid in some of the presentations. And I think specifying, so is the idea providing transparency and avoiding the circumvention of existing campaign finance regulations, you know, against potential dark money expenditures or foreign expenditures. If that's the goal, that has implications for how you design a reporting system and what needs to be reported. Or is the idea to facilitate counter speech and address misinformation? That would then have specific, you know, I think each of those approaches have different answers for some of the questions that have been raised for today's agenda. And so delineating the goals and the sort of the state interests that are at issue here, I think could be important. And I'd like to hear more from the commission and from other task force members.
Thank you. Do other task force members have any preliminary observations before we get going?
Yeah,
Dr.
this
Wood?
is Abby. I just want to second what Thad said. I think that once we are clear on the purpose behind doing this, we'll have a lot better guidance for what we should be recommending and where we should go.
All right, thank you. Any other task force members wish to speak on this before we move into the agenda? All right. Well, I think, why don't we just begin with that question? I think actually the professors Kauser and Wood raised, I think it's an important question. Why don't we just begin there? Speaking for myself, this is important to me, and I think the interests are, there's a couple interests. I don't know that I would say it's just one interest in particular. I think first and foremost, I believe that the Political Reform Act, one of the entire purposes of that is to ensure transparency in spending and in political speech in California state and local elections. And I think a centralized database where voters and members of the public can easily determine who is paying for the political advertisements that they are receiving through digital media is consistent and an important part of the spirit and the intent of the Political Reform Act. And so to me, transparency and the intent of the Political Reform Act is probably the number one, the first goal there. I think as a part of that, I think it also would serve as a sort of ensuring compliance and enforcement standpoint as well. So I guess you could also characterize it as anti-circumvention, right? Once we have the database, we can then test to ensure that the items in the database are actually being properly reported and the information provided to the voters consistent with the law and the regulations. And I do think there is a third element to this, and that is assisting with counter speech. I think that is an important consideration for me and for the commission. I think that's, at least speaking for myself, I'm not sure I'd put that number one, but I think that's part of it. And I frankly think that's part of why we have transparency writ large in the Political Reform Act and other areas. I mean, the whole point is by being transparent, that will help facilitate at some level counter speech. So that's my sense of why this is a worthy endeavor, why we should be doing this. Vice Chair Hayward, I don't know if you want to go next on that and speak on behalf of the commission.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, I think our what we're doing here is probably going to be guided by, what we were created to do generally. Only now we're talking about the digital world specifically. So, making people accountable for their paid political advertising is a very core part of what we do. And that means that we make them put their name on things, we make them record the expenditure, and this is just sort of, I think, a step that is a catalog of the things we already require. I'm sympathetic to the counter speech thing. That point, I guess that seems a bit different from what the Political Reform Act has the FPPC doing already. I think that's something that maybe happens organically once the information is out there. But I'm not sure we can be put in a position where we're actually, requiring people to divulge parts of confidential strategy to their opponents. I mean, that may happen sort of indirectly as clever people look at the database, but that's for them to do. So that would be just the one point I'd make sort of on the global points. And then, we're going to be restricted by, Supreme Court precedent. What's a political ad? Well, we've been fighting about that for 30 years I know of anyway. And, that's something that I don't think we're really in a position to push back on too strongly. But given that, I mean, I think having, a library of what people have done that is activity that we already regulate is going to be super useful. It's going to be really useful to be able to see that somebody is, popped through the $1,000 expenditure threshold for becoming an independent expenditure committee. We don't really have those tools right now, and I think that would be very beneficial. Thanks.
Thank you. Do other task force members wish to speak on this?
Yeah, this is James Schwab, Secretary of State's office. When Secretary Padilla introduced very similar legislation as a state senator, I think that the simple goal was transparency. But with the spread and increased usage of online and digital advertising, and especially what we've seen in 2016 and 2018 with misinformation and disinformation, the need for transparency and to understand what voters are seeing and consuming, I think is more important to the health of our democracy. And so I think it's another same goal of full transparency, but with, I think the stakes are higher even today than they were, must be about 8 years ago when we introduced the legislation.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schwab. Other task force members wish to address this issue? Seeing none, I think.
Well, actually,
Mr. Schwab,
I've got one little thing, which is when Commissioner Hayward brought up accountability, I thought, yeah, that's why we have transparency, is for accountability. So then when we think about things like targeting, which I've been an advocate for disclosing, but I mean, we can kick it around. I guess the question is, who holds people accountable for their political speech? Because if we're trying to facilitate the state holding people accountable, I don't know if we need the targeting criteria. But if we're trying to facilitate the public, right, or other campaigns or whatever holding people accountable for their political speech, then I think the targeting criteria becomes helpful. So so also kind of who does the holding accountable and who is kind of supposed to under this design might be interesting to talk about or helpful to talk about.
Well, I think that's a good point, Professor Wade. I appreciate you going back to accountability, because I was going to say, I think when Mr. Schwab was talking about his experience and the Secretary of State's experience, accountability was a word that came to my mind. And to me, when I think of accountability and what we're doing here today, it's accountability. I don't believe that it would be appropriate for our agency, at least, to ever weigh in one way or the other on the truthfulness of an advertisement or to ever engage in any type of government censorship. I think what we do, though, is fulfill an important accountability function through transparency, by making it transparent who it is that is speaking to the voters. If the voters see advertisements which they believe are repeatedly incorrect or factually flawed, it is only through transparency that they're going to be able to hold those folks accountable for what they're trying to say. So to me, when we talk about accountability, that's the type of accountability that I think is appropriate for the agency to be concerned with and state government. I'm not sure what accountability is increased or provided if we have the targeting data. It seems to me that's slightly different. That's more, to me, that just seems different. That's more of a question of is it right to target perhaps or something of that nature. But I think that's slightly different than accountability with regard to who's paying for something so we can hold them accountable for what they're saying.
So just to talk about the targeting for a minute. So I think the thing I've kind of pushed in my writing is that you want to be able to reach the same audience, because that's the audience that they need to be held accountable in front of. So that's it. It's not as much about like micro-targeting is bad or any of that, like, or even about people's kind of the viewer's right to know who was targeting, although of course that's, you know, interesting and important, but it's specifically when it comes to counter speech, the targeting helps facilitate accountability before the same audience was kind of the rationale that I've written about.
Right. Okay. All right. Do other task force members have any further comments on the what we were talking about, sort of the underlying rationale? Why are we interested in creating this database?
This is Jennifer Wagner from the League again. I think it would be interesting, you know, as we think about people that we might want to have speak to the task force in the future, hearing from potentially journalists or from grassroots campaigns of color, businesses that use political ads to promote their work. Maybe they don't necessarily work for a campaign, but maybe they're artists that design political t-shirts and other things. So I just think maybe expanding a little bit beyond the traditional really big campaigns that we normally think of into some of the more, you know, so many of the articles that are in our library say how fantastic it is that social media has opened up the opportunity for these much smaller independent folks that are running for small local office or who have a very local issue that they're going to campaign on. I don't think we have them represented as well here. And so potentially hearing a little bit more about how these regulations impact them and how well they're able to comply with them and the fears they have might be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Thank you for raising that. And let me just pause here and just say that I think, you know, it's always a challenge to put together a task force and decide who's going to be on it, make it a manageable size, different perspectives. But what I would ask, and I was remiss in not mentioning this at our first meeting, task force members should feel absolutely welcome to reach out to their constituents, to reach out to folks that they may know, and bring those voices to the table. I think this will work better if each of us reaches out to folks we think may be interested and spreads the word about what we're doing here and how they can engage. And of course, they can participate digitally through digital public comments. They can submit written comments like the ones we received. So just sort of my pitch to please, if you have folks in mind, reach out to them and have them submit comments. We welcome it for sure. All right, so we're going to move on then to the first question in our agenda, which I think I have a sense of where the group may be on it, about whether California should create and maintain an online archive that has copies and information about our paid political advertisements in state elections. Are there task force members who don't think that's a good idea at this point or have reservations about it?
Chair Manich, I have a nitpick.
Commissioner Hayward, the floor is yours.
Well, the way it's written, California state elections, I think we're all anticipating this will be elections regardless of whether they're state, local ballot measures, as long as it's an elected official in California, we're interested in those advertisements. That's correct, right?
That is correct. State and local elections.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you, as always, Commissioner Hayward, for helping me out with those. All right, so I think we are unanimous that this is a worthy thing to continue talking about. So let's move on to the next question, which I think hopefully will engender a little bit more discussion then. But what types of, and I've put it in quotes intentionally, political advertisements should be maintained in the archive? We obviously have different species of quote political advertisements. We have the campaign ads, which I think everybody understands pretty well, independent expenditures, but then also issue advocacy. So where are task force members at in terms of what types of political activities should be housed within the online archive?
Katie Zoglin, League of Women Voters. One area is in the government code sections, which just went into effect in January. They talk about having the ads, the platforms, the different internet platforms post some of the disclosures. So I would like to see something that connects that up with the state archive. So perhaps there's a link between the two, or at least at the very minimum, the same information that's disclosed pursuant to those government code sections that just went into effect, that those are also part of any archive.
Thank you. And just for everyone else's benefit, I believe the existing law that just went into effect refers to campaign ads and independent expenditure ads, where it would be the two types of political spending to be subject to the archive requirement. What about issue ads? I know one of our comment letters went beyond just direct buy and independent expenditures and suggested that issue ads might also be included in our archive. I'm curious how task force members feel about that.
So this is Thad Kauser again. So I would love to hear what that definition would be and how broad it would be. So if I got an email from a group talking about some bill that mentions a bill in the California legislature, is that a digital issue ad? Then is the triggering mechanism the mention of specific state or local legislation? And is this, any kind of platform? I could see that being quite broad, but I'd love to hear more specifics on how this would be defined.
Thank you. Do other task force members have comment on this? Commissioner Hayward, you're smiling.
Well, sure, because the devil is in the details. In this case, the definition of what an issue ad is, and and again, this is something we've been fighting about for a long time. And do you put a temporal bracket around speech before an election and say that something that wouldn't be part of the archive 31 days out suddenly becomes part of the archive 30 days out because it's got this temporal character to it that makes it more likely to be trying to influence an election? Do you look for different kinds of speakers? Do you look for different kinds of messages? And I think this may be one of those places where the perfect is the enemy of the good, to the extent you think that more disclosure's better, and that we would limit it to what we understand to be political expenditures under the Political Reform Act and under the relevant precedents from the Supreme Court, and make it, paid ads and independent expenditures. Because I don't really think that if we start wading into the issue ad swamp, we're going to really like what we find.
Is there some, I'm sorry, Abby Wood, USC, is there some kind of middle ground where we could have issue ads recorded, but have kind of less information gathered on them? I know that they're kind of treated as special and allowed to be anonymous in certain ways or whatever. I just wonder if there's a way to gather the information, but still protect, still draw the lines that we think the court would support or would uphold. And then one other comment while I'm talking is that, when we're doing stuff online, the temporal windows don't really matter, because you can post something today that's nasty about one of the candidates and then circulate it as an October surprise, before the general election. And it would have been posted ahead of time and all the money would have changed hands ahead of time. And then you kind of activate your networks to send it around and retweet it or, share it on Facebook or whatever. And so I think we want to be wary about using time and windows to kind of help make it okay in the eyes of the court. But I do wonder if there's some way to at least, have the ad up and gather whatever information we can about it, but still kind of walk the line we need to walk for the court.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Wouldn't you be subjecting digital ads to far more disclosure than, say, TV or radio ads for issue campaigns, given that you could pretty much put a vote no on SB 539 on TV without having to have any of the same disclaimers, I believe, as you do for a candidate or an independent expenditure. So I would just again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you'd be subjecting digital ads to much stricter standards than exist for TV, radio, and otherwise.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking whether there's a middle ground to keep the ad itself, right?
But
Okay.
I mean, there's also a question here in that for TV and radio, there isn't nearly the same turnaround time and obfuscation generally that there can be with digital ads. And so I don't know that I necessarily want to say that, well, they should be the same, because they aren't the same. And it's possible that different standards could potentially be justified or beneficial.
Yeah, I think the part of my concern with issue ads, at least proposing that we include them out the gate to the same extent as other types of ads, is that we still don't have, as Mr. Brokaw alluded to, we don't have the same rules in place currently in statute for issue ads that we have for campaign ads and independent expenditures. I do think, and we saw this even this year, there's a bill pending that would impose new disclosure requirements on issue ads. The legislature, it does not look like, is going to be taking up the bill this year because of the pandemic. Their attention is elsewhere. But I think we can see that as an area that may come up in the next few years. So I think at a minimum, what we may want to do as we go through this is perhaps recommend that whatever archive design we agree upon, it allows for the future addition of issue ads to that archive once and if there is a statutory authority to collect that information. So I guess to Professor Wood's point, that would be my middle ground, is we want to build this out and facilitate it to be forward-looking, so that if issue ads do become subject to greater regulation, they can be included in the archive. But I don't know that we could impose the requirement of their inclusion today, given the lack of statutory authority to regulate issue ads.
So just one more question on this. What if we kept a difference between the disclosure of them, or the reporting of them, and the disclosure of them, so that the ads were kept by the state but not put up to be made public, so that we would at least have them on file?
And are you, just so I understand your question, are you suggesting that the entity that creates and publishes the issue ad would be responsible for providing a copy of that to the state?
Yeah, is that I am. I don't know if that's a big step or not. I've never fully understood why we treat them so differently. So that's part of my deal, is like, could we at least have them where we, where, I don't know, you can FOIA them, or journalists could get them, or, I don't know, but they're just not put up online. There's just a bunch of different ways to do middle grounds on this stuff that are just worth, considering before we say, oh, no issue ads.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. Katie?
Oh, so, I mean, one option, I don't know, you know, if we decide to recommend doing the platform, would there be an option for sort of like public adding to it or making submissions? So to perhaps address Abby's, or I was going to say Commissioner Wood's, Task Force Member Wood's question. So, you know, to sort of start creating some kind of database so that there might be, you know, some factual basis if there's future efforts are warranted or desired. But I don't know if that's possible to have some interface such that the public could add issue ads or something that somebody might feel problematic, and then the commission can decide whatever to do with it. Just an idea out there.
Yeah, we do, currently at the commission, it's not a perfect analogy, but one thing that we do, which is helpful around elections, is we have the AdWatch program. And this is a program whereby members of the public can submit copies, screenshots of advertisements, billboards that they receive. Now, the purpose of that is typically they're submitting something that doesn't have a disclaimer on it, so they're asking for our assistance to hunt down who's paying for it and why they haven't included the disclaimer. That's really the only circumstance that I'm aware of, though, where we would actually ask a member of the public to submit something, as opposed to within sort of the statutory authority that we have, imposing a requirement that a member of the regulated community who's subject to our jurisdiction provide information to us. But at this point, I'm going to ask Mr. Bainbridge, our lawyer, who I see is following us on Zoom, to perhaps give us a little bit of background on what extent, if any, we have at the commission to impose requirements at this point with regard to issue advertisements. So, Mr. Bainbridge?
Maybe Suki Brar can better answer that question. She's the one that's up on this stuff in the legal division.
All right, Ms. Brar?
Hi. So currently, under the Act, we do have a little bit of regulation on issue ads. Basically, what we define as an issue ad is something that clearly identifies a candidate or measure, but doesn't contain express advocacy, and it's issued within 45 days of an election. And so for those, there's extra reporting. There's a special report. It's called the E530. And so that report is filed online with the Secretary of State. And that report doesn't have a copy of the ad, but it contains who paid for it and the subject of the ad, basically, and some other information about identifying who's paying.
So just so I'm clear, Ms. Brar, then, so with respect to issue ads, then our requirement is that they disclose certain information, but that the information itself is being disclosed to the Secretary of State's office?
Correct.
Okay. And I won't hold you to this, but off the top of your head, do you think that there is room for us, if we wanted to add an additional requirement that a copy of the issue ad be sent along with the information about who paid for it, et cetera, so we could start building an archive of those types of ads?
I'd have to do research on whether that's permissible under case law, so I'm not sure off the top of my head on that, but I can do some research on that and find out if that would be okay.
Okay, yeah, I think that'd be helpful for the task force if you did that. Thank you.
I have a question about the AdWatch program. I've been thinking a lot about the current budget crisis and how long California is going to be struggling to fund anything. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of things that are not going to be going forward within the legislature as well because of needing to focus on urgent matters. I'm curious, for an existing program, would there be an opportunity there to potentially beef that up or expand it in the meantime while we wait for additional resources for a repository or for new initiatives? I'm just curious kind of where that fits in terms of funding and potential expansion.
Well, I think at this point, the information, at least that our agency has, is that the cost to create a very straightforward database of political advertisements would not be cost prohibitive. And that's preliminary data. I mean, I want to be very careful when I say that. Of course, the devil's in the details. But I'm not sure that we would need to necessarily expand AdWatch. That's a very specific program for a specific purpose. My preference would probably be that we keep the two things separated and more focused. But to the extent that you have a concern about budgetary impacts and this, at least speaking for myself, I'm not at the point where I'm necessarily concerned that that's going to be an impediment for us with this. Any other comments on the, it sounds like we have consensus, at a minimum, we have consensus about paid political advertisements, campaign ads, I should say, and independent expenditures being included, with a question mark as to whether or not legally we could include issue ads as well. Is that a fair restatement of where everybody's at? All right.
Yeah, I have a potential clarifying question and then a comment that follows. I think it was very useful that Mr. Brokaw raised the question of the parallels between how digital ads and other media ads are regulated. So that, and this was also something, this is an analogy brought up in the Campaign Legal Center's brief. So the clarifying question is, in 2A, there's no mention of digital advertisements, right? So is the idea here is that this would be an online archive that would include television, radio, and what we now consider to be digital advertisements? And then the point I'm trying to make here is, of course, we all are trying to design something for, not just to respond to today's technology and media, but 10, 20 years into the future. As one of the trends that we've seen is this merging of these different platforms. Your television is becoming your computer becomes your television. Mr. Wairenga talked last week about radio and internet radio being very similar, merged. So is what we're talking about something just for internet ads, or is this any kind of ad on TV, radio, or the internet, and anything here and there in between?
Well, if you're asking what my wish list would be, I think it would be more like Los Angeles, where it's essentially everything. With this, our work, I think, is more sharply focused here on digital media, just because that's less regulated than traditional forms of campaign activity at this point, and I frankly think presents greater dangers in some ways. So, but I think the archive itself, in a perfect world, would include everything. Everything in terms of paid direct political ads and independent expenditures. I want to be clear about that. Did you have more, Mr. Kauser, before we move on to Mr. Schwab, though?
Just briefly, I think my inclination on this would be expanding across all media would be the right big net to cast in line with that. And I see many thorny issues in expanding to issue ads. And so I think something focused on all campaign and direct campaign and independent expenditures across all media, I think would be most fruitful.
Great, thank you. Mr. Schwab?
Thank you. I'm not proposing a new item, but just for purposes of discussion and information, I think what we're focused on, one second. The joys of working from home.
That's awesome.
Is our discussion revolves around extending our traditional means of transparency to one of the newer frontiers, which is digital online marketing and advertising. And that's an important step. And if you take sort of the larger maybe mission and goal of transparency in our democracy, transparency in our elections, there's a big piece that I think, I don't know if this is the space for it or a separate discussion item. And that's a lot of the misinformation, or most of the misinformation we see and disinformation we see online is not paid advertisement. It's, I don't know what the term is, if it's organic, and it's promoted through perhaps bots or followers. And here's an example. During the March election, we tracked a video that had some misinformation about how the election process worked. And the video garnered tens of thousands of views, was retweeted and shared, a couple thousand times. In reaction, we put together a video, we promoted it, we paid for an advertisement to sort of counter that message. And it got maybe 1/10 of the viewership that the original post got. And so I think that area of, yeah, I'll just call it organic content is what we're trying to wrap our heads around too. You know, I think there's the paid advertisements, that more traditional types of advertisements that come from campaigns and candidates and issue campaigns. But to me, one of the unknown pieces is the organic material that's also impacting elections and democracy, but it's not in any sort of traditional, under any traditional regulatory scheme. And I don't even know if we want to, you know, venture down that road, but just as a point of information, I think it's important to keep that in mind, is a lot of what's harming election activity are non-paid advertisements.
So I've
Can I
got
ask
a
a
little, oh,
follow-up
sorry.
question
Go ahead.
real quick, Mr. Schwab, because I think it's an excellent point. But my question is, when you talk about organic, unpaid ads, are you talking about something that begins as paid content and then is subsequently shared multiple times by users, and so it's dispersed in that fashion? Or are you talking about really somebody who just is standing, you know, on their proverbial soapbox, and then it is shared multiple times, and that individual does not have any connection and no paid relationship with any campaign whatsoever?
That's where it gets a little murky. I think some of it looks like just organic, natural, spur of the moment type of content. Some might be a little more polished. There might be some funding behind it. We don't know. Yeah, I think you see a mix of both. Some of the content's more polished. Some of it's a little more rough around the edges, but they get so many more impressions and shares and views than any of our content ever does.
Thank you. Professor Wood?
Sorry, I got excited on that because I put a section in a paper one time about this. And, you know, one thought, this was with, you know, former FPPC Commissioner Ravel. One thing we thought was, you know, if they're paying for these bots, or if they're paying someone to make this video, then there is money exchanging hands for this stuff, even if they're not paying the platform itself. And so even if it's really a difficult enforcement problem, if the regulations could be written such that that exchange of money brings them under your jurisdiction, it might at least have some sort of deterrent effect on behavior we want to dissuade that would attract a lot of attention and that sort of thing. I mean, we might veer into kind of substance at some point, but it seems like there is money involved in many of these, not all of them, right? Some of them are just really clever kids who come up with cool stuff, but sometimes they're pretty well produced. And so maybe that exchange of money can trigger jurisdiction.
Another example is there's, you know, Russia Today, RT, had a video on one of their shows. Again, it was pushing out misinformation about the California election. And on the YouTube channel, it just says, you know, this poster, Russia Today, is paid for by the Russian government writ large. But to understand what does that mean for this specific show, it's an American who's hosting the show. It's an American who's, you know, putting out the misinformation. And again, in one of those gray areas where there's a little bit of disclosure in terms of the source of Russia Today, but they have advertisements on there, and you know, that's the extent to which you know, the money exchanges hands for that content. That's unknown to us too. That's a good point.
Well, I think to Professor Wood's point, I think if it's a circumstance in which there was a payment made, obviously over the applicable threshold to produce a video, that payment by a campaign that's subject to our jurisdiction, that expenditure should be reported. So there should be some basic disclosure of the payment there. I think to my mind where it gets problematic is, okay, so even if that payment is disclosed, it's buried in a campaign report someplace, and unless there is a disclaimer that's affixed to the content that's then shared multiple times, there's no way for the user, for the person who receives that message through their, you know, Facebook page or what have you, to know that that's paid political advertisement. So I think this may be an area where our efforts are on things about the disclaimers that should be affixed to it. Or I know some folks have talked about using symbols and making them uniform, which to me strikes me as an interesting idea for us to talk about, maybe not today, but at a future meeting, so that if a voter is receiving advertisements, political advertisements that don't have that symbol, the hope would be that would trigger some reaction into them to have to be more skeptical about that advertisement, or at least inquire further about who is paying for it. I don't know if other task force members have thoughts on that or further comment on that area.
This is Jennifer Wagner from the League of Women Voters. So one of the things that I often compare this to is to anti-spam, which has a long history. And so what a lot of the platforms have seen is that now we're down to about a month-long cycle where someone finds out what the rules are on a platform or what the regulations are from a government, and someone figures out an exploit. And so they violate that for a week or two, and they have incredible results. And then everybody else realizes that, oh, this is what they're doing. And then everybody else jumps on, and then the platform shuts it down. It's unlikely that governments can change their regulations that fast. So one of the things I've been talking to a lot of platform experts about is how we take what we learn from anti-spam work and apply it to incorrect information or political ads that aren't disclosed today. And part of it really comes down to having the flexibility where these platforms work with regulators very closely to look at new trends and come up with new ways to remain in the spirit of the law without having to deal with all the technicalities of what exactly the laws are. Because as soon as you say very explicitly, well, you have to have this size font and this and that, they figure out some way to play with that. Well, this is where you have to disclose who's paying for what. Well, how can we get a middleman to do that so we don't actually have to say who we are? So I think there's a difficulty in the government trying to do this because our turnaround just isn't fast enough. We're not flexible enough. And I don't have a solution to that, but I'm just saying that's kind of where I'm thinking about things. And I'm curious if other people have ideas around this area of how we become more nimble without disclosing to the bad actors what we're doing.
That's a good point. Do task force members have thoughts on that?
I mean, the only thing I can think that Katie Soglin is the more specific you make the regulations, then the more easy it is to avoid it. So if you make it more general language, so it's, as you were indicating, sort of the spirit, that a general principle as opposed to details about the font.
All right, thank you. Other folks have comments on this? All right, seeing none. All right, so let us then turn to the next item, which is item C. What types of information about the advertisement should be maintained in the archive? I imagine this is going to be a fun one. So. Professor Wood, I know you may have strongly held views on this.
I mean, I like the list, I like the list Map Light sent around. I like the Brennan Center's list. I like capturing this stuff. I think it's, like it's a really thorny regulatory problem. And there's a great study out of the University of Wisconsin that shows that of all the disinformation that was floating around on Facebook before the 2016 election, only something like 8% of the speakers were even registered with the FEC. So I mean, we're only going to capture a fraction of the mess that goes on. But I think that we should capture as much of it as we can within the bounds of the laws. And I know that it seems to me that the big fault line is going to be on, whether we do targeting, whether we also require, the audience to be reachable and not just targets that were purchased on the platform, because all that does is push everybody to send a list to the platform that they get from the consultants. I mean, I know where the fault lines are. I have some opinions about where we should be on it, but I want to hear what everybody else has to say about these things too.
Yeah, no, I think that I suspect under C we have 5 Roman numerals. I suspect most folks would I think, be in agreement that a copy of the ad, the cost, who paid for it, who are the vendors, and when and where the advertisement ran. That's pretty basic disclosure. I mean, that's very similar to what we already do with TV, radio, regular campaign ads. So I think you're right. I mean, the real question here is there a reason and a justification for us to go beyond that with respect to digital? And this is something where I think, to Professor Kauser's point, this may be a unique discussion with respect to digital when we talk about targeting. Let's talk about that.
I want to say I also have concerns about the copy of the advertisement, because so much advertising now is based on variation, and there can be a pretty nasty variation that maybe didn't get to a particular threshold and is used to kind of bury some of the uglier parts of campaigning in a nicer looking ad. And also talking to someone about how artificial intelligence is now being used, where the original person who created the ad in Facebook has a lot of control and moves things in and out and turns things on and off. But if you're looking at banner ads and things that go out through Google, their product is AI will take your ad and work with a bunch of different permutations, and you can set how broad those are, and they'll play with little tiny targets and say, well, what happens in this target, which target is best, what combinations are best. So you might have thousands of different versions of an ad. And if you're saying, well, is it the total number of people you've reached in the ad being run and the spend, or are you looking at only that particular version of the ad? I think the reporting requirements for this might get really difficult really fast.
Yeah, this is Rena Davis with Google. I would second that, those exact comments. It's a very complex, sort of thing. It's not as if it's just one, TV spot that ran, at 8:05 p.m. on CBS. It gets to be these iterations, and so it can be difficult. Having some of those buckets where the identifiers are, it can be useful, but it's very difficult to recreate. Again, based on the AI and the way that things are put out and advertisers are using it.
I think this is a hugely helpful discussion. I'd love to hear more from Ms. Davis and from other campaign professionals. So I see sort of two potential complexities, but I want to go back and tie these to the overall goals of transparency, of anti-circumvention. So one possibility, if an ad is described, if we define an ad as one version of something that is A/B tested 1,000 times, right? Then one potential worry there is, since if the ad buy is 10 grand and you're testing 1,000 versions, well, then they all fall under the disclosure threshold, and that raises this circumvention worry, right? So a very strict definition of each ad as what appeared once before a human could dice that expenditure too finely. But of course, if you say, well, if just when you made one buy of a general ad that had multiple versions, then we miss the one that makes the opposing candidate's skin tone look really dark, right? Or something like that. I'm trying to think of like what is an effect, font type. Yeah, we're not so worried about that, but there could be variations of the ad, particular language, particular skin tone, something like that could create problems. And so I would love to hear from people who are making these ad buys about what are these variations, what are typical ones, and how many iterations do we normally have in an ad buy, as well as all the task force members on this thorny issue.
This is Amber Maltby, and just going to playing off of Thad's point right now, I think we also need to look at what is the burden on very small campaigns with very low budgets, and trying, how much are we asking them to set aside in their for compliance costs in their budget to figure out what they need to report and to comply with those, and are we causing them to not be able to communicate with their voters because of it? I think that's something we need to keep in mind.
To ask you a question, and I don't know who among our group is best equipped, maybe many people are, to answer this, but when a purchase is made to run an advertisement on, let's say, Google, and I appreciate Ms. Davis's comment that there may, through the use of AI, there may be multiple derivations of that advertisement. So is there a sort of a base template that is then provided to the platform that then the AI may change over time. But is there at least, I guess my question is there at least at a minimum a base template that could be disclosed, even if the thousands or hundreds of derivations would be onerous?
So are you speaking to like the varying levels or, sorry, just put that go. Are you speaking to the different buckets of kind of information that are used to push out these derivations?
I'm thinking more, I mean, sorry, please.
No, good.
Well, so what I'm trying to think about, and some of this is for the public's benefit too, so they can just sort of understand how the process works. But so a campaign wants to put out an advertisement on Google, let's say. Are they providing Google with a basic template of the language, for example, that they want included, and AI is changing the presentation of that in some way? Are they, so just kind of, maybe you could help us understand that process more.
Yes, definitely, exactly. So they will provide a basic template, and to Jennifer's point, you know, kind of some variations. They will then, you know, put that into the system. Our AI, when, you know, their targets, kind of their voters that they're looking for, and then our AI will move forward and run varying cycles of that ad. Then that information is given back to the campaigns and they're able to adjust as they see fit.
Okay, so the input from the campaign is a basic ad, and I think what you just said was sort of the audience that they would, some information about the audience that they want to reach. The platform then takes that input and outputs maybe, you know, different derivations of the ad based on the audience that they want to reach. Is that basically how it
or for
works?
the websites for the area that they're trying to reach, so that not so much like the targeted person that they're trying to reach, but the general scope of kind of users that they're trying to reach.
Okay. Do the platforms maintain copies of all the different derivations that are pushed out based on the template?
We don't maintain copies of all the derivations. We maintain copies of the different buckets of information that are given to us by the campaign. That's available in our transparency report, you know, that was detailed in our last meeting. And so all that information is downloadable and, you know, can be viewed by folks.
So in terms of creating a sort of a centralized state database of this information, it sounds like it is possible, to Ms. Maltby's point, it may be onerous to ask the campaigns to provide anything more than the initial template and perhaps even the ask of what audiences they want to reach. I mean, that seems like that may be basic information the campaigns could reach. But then the platforms, the vendors that are pushing those out, if they're maintaining archives of that, then it seems to me that they could provide that information to the state. Is that fair to say?
In terms of providing it directly to the state for the purposes of populating the database, is that
correct?
I think it's, well, all the information is already available in our transparency report. So it would be more of a conversion of that information by the state, kind of a grabbing of it. So it's already there. It's not something that, you know, we would need to produce specifically for this purpose. I think though that, you know, placing the onus on the platform is understandable given the size of the platform of Google around, you know, providing the transparency report that we're producing. And I'm not sure if there's questions or if there's, you know, I know that during the conversation last time, we didn't go too deeply into people's thoughts and feelings on the varying ways in which we are collecting information. But I think for us, it's extremely comprehensive. And so if that you know, set of information satisfies, you know, the need that this, you know, the task force thinks needs to be fulfilled, I think that's something, you know, that could be utilized. But if, you know, working with the, you know, and completely conscious of the demands on smaller campaigns that are not, you know, heavily funded, but if they're providing this information, you know, already, I don't necessarily think that it's a huge lift for them to, you know, submit that if the submission is made easy. And I think that's where, you know, there can be some aid provided for those campaigns to ensure that they're not having to recreate the wheel and, you know, come, you know, kind of out of a different lane in terms of compliance and that they can use the compliance that they're already doing and the tools that they're already using to run the ads to ensure that they're able to provide the information that's necessary to the state.
Right, and just so we're clear, what I'm trying to do is, I suppose, is sort of thread the needle where if the ultimate goal is that the public has maximum transparency with respect to digital advertisements on social media, let's say, and the campaigns have easy access to a basic template of what they want in terms of the advertisement and basic information on who they want to reach. But I think what I just heard was that's really just the beginning of the story. Then there could be multiple derivations of that are ultimately pushed out to voters. So what the voters see isn't necessarily the template. They are experiencing something very different. And so for the voters then, if they're seeing something different, the only way for them to trace what they're seeing back to a source of money would be for that information to be contained in the database as well, it seems to me.
I'm not sure. So if there's an ad that's being run currently right now, voters can trace it back. Right? And you're suggesting that, I guess I'm not sure, is it that there's an absence of information for voters to be able to follow back to that source, or is it that, I guess I'm not clear on that part.
Yeah, so think of it this way, and this is at least how I'm conceiving of it. If I want to know what advertisements social media advertisements were being run in Senate District 5, let's say, during a particular date range, I could go to the database, I could put in that date range, and I would get all the different advertisements. If the only source of input into that archive is information from the campaigns, based on what I just heard, it would not contain the actual ads that the voters saw on Facebook, because the ads the voters actually saw would look different in many instances because of the AI functionality on the platform. And so my suggestion was you couple the two sources of information. So the state archive would actually draw information both directly from the regulated community to the extent they have it, and then add the information from the platforms, which is all the different variations of that advertisement. So the voters could see this is what was put out, and these are the different derivations of this advertisement. So they could see it all in one place.
Okay, now I understand. Thank you for explaining it again. I think the issue with that is that we're not keeping track of all of these derivations in terms of, to Jennifer's point, there's a multitude of them. And that's why, I think also it might be helpful, and I can have some of my colleagues, join us next time, or in the interim, provide some information around the types of derivations that you're seeing. And so I think that might shed some light on, what these ads look like, how different they are from one, kind of view to another. What are these buckets? And again, all that information is contained in the transparency report. And so if folks would like to go on and look at that way, I'm also happy to connect the commission and the task force to colleagues of mine who can go into detail on it. But I do think that, placing that burden on the platforms, leads to I don't, from my understanding, it's just not something that is actually possible given the sheer number of variations that are run in the minutia that can be tweaked.
All right, thank you. Do other task force members wish to speak on this issue? Ms. Oglen?
I just have a clarification question for Ms. Davis. Could you, I'm not very familiar with your transparency report. Can you say how is that publicly accessible? Where does one find it, and what's in it? Thank you.
Yes, of course. I'm happy to go over that. At a high level, it's a transparency report that allows folks to see all of the political advertisements that are run on our platforms in that text granular files. And it was, I wouldn't do justice to the presentation that someone did. I apologize for not knowing that person's name during our last meeting. But it is something that's publicly available. It's available on our website. Anyone can download it. Anyone can look at that data and kind of run it through their own processes and analysis. So it's something that we put out as a service to the public because we want to ensure that there is transparency around these issues. I'm happy to provide that link as well.
You guys already give your targeting criteria that people have paid for on the platform. And I'm wondering what happens if somebody says, I want to target all women between the ages of 40 and 55 in California. And so that's kind of they're hitting the gender and the age and the geography. And then they say, here's $1,000. How does Google prioritize who gets it? And is there any way using the transparency report to be able to recover that actual audience? Or is it just like kind of a black box from the broad targeting criteria and the amount that was spent?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm about 7 months into my time at Google, so I'm not familiar with the intrinsic details of that, but I'm happy to follow up with you on that. And like I said, it might be a good idea for us to have some of my colleagues come and do some presentation of this information and go a little bit into detail on some of these questions. So apologies, but we'll get back to you on that.
No, that's fine. I've been going around saying you guys do such a great job, but I've always had this question about how that works. Because if we were able to just take what Google already does and apply it elsewhere, right, it'd still be interesting to know whether we could recover the audiences or not. So that was the point of the question. So thanks.
Of course. And just as for folks who are listening in, the website is transparencyreport.google.com if you're interested in taking a look at that.
If we're talking about potential things to explore in how Google Ads works, one of the things I found interesting in one of the public comments was that I think Anne Ravel suggested that there could be a unique identifier from the purchaser all the way through all of the middle gray ground of marketing to when an ad actually appears on a website. And everyone that I've talked to has said that that is really hard, that it's actually very hard to trace all the way through all of the different middle operators. And that's why many people don't know where their ads end up. They just know the results and how much traffic it drives when they use that particular buying system, which is very complicated. And so I would love in particular to learn a little bit more about how that kind of tracking might work, because everyone that I've talked to has said it kind of wouldn't. So I would be curious to know more about that. In case that isn't clear to anyone, if you're familiar with Sleeping Giants, they're one of the advocacy groups that actually looks for ads that are appearing on sites that are political and go after the corporations that are advertising there, saying, did you even know that your ad is on this platform? And often they don't, or they claim that they don't. So that's that's one example that you might be more familiar with how hard it is to track from buying your ad to where it ends up.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that, Ms. Wagner? So when you talk about unique identifier, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind, of course, is sort of the FPPC ID number, right? That's our version of unique identifier. So is the idea being that an advertisement would be issued a particular number, like the FPPC ID number, and that would be affixed to the ad from the time the campaign, I guess, puts it out there all the way through the chain and the multiple derivations? Is that the idea?
I'd have to go back and reread because it was a recent comment, so I read it pretty fast 2 days ago or when it came in. So exactly how that identifier would work, but essentially it's trying to tie who bought this ad, who's responsible for the ad, and how it actually then ended up being seen by people, so that ID number, I think, whether it's for a single ad, whether it's for a single campaign, or for it's a single buyer, I'm not sure. I think that was kind of left open.
All right.
I've got it up. It says unique ID number for the advertiser, such as IDs assigned to filers by the FPPC, unique ID number for the ad content and for each ad instance.
So it's all of them, different IDs.
Let me pose a question to the task force. How important is it when we're thinking about the database? How important is it for the database to, in your view, contain all the different versions of an advertisement that the voters may see? Is that overkill?
This is Amber again. I think it might be just because, we know that the different advertisements might change just by a slight color variation. Nothing is significant, but that the campaign vis-a-vis the vendor knows will have a slightly different impact on a different voter, but I don't know if that provides with the type of transparency of substance that we're looking to accomplish here.
All right, thank you. To other task force members, is that the general consensus? It probably is overkill to try and get all the derivations.
My understanding, and I mean, we've got campaign professionals here, but my understanding is that a lot of times they're just changing background color or font. And so we might be able to write into the proposal that those kinds of derivations we don't consider like a new version of the ad. But if you're altering the appearance of somebody or something like that, that would be an example of something that would be considered a new version of the ad. I don't know if you would say new version, but whatever language we want to use.
I just think the technical specifications of what's considered a significant version versus not is going to be pretty hard. It seems like existing legislation focuses on like the number of views or the amount money spent or whatever. And so if an ad ends up being a very significant, small portion below a threshold that we set or as a percentage of the larger work, I could see that happening. But again, I think it's really complicated to track the different versions across platforms. And so particularly when Rena's coworkers, Ms. Davis's coworkers present, I think that's a better question for them than for us, because I think if these large platforms are responsible, what's easy and what isn't would be a good question.
Would it be reasonable along the lines that were just suggested by Professor Wood to think about, we don't care about font or color potentially, right? If you're thinking about sort of what people are exposed to, but changes in appearance, but changes in wording. So for instance, I'm going to crack down on protesters versus I'm going to crack down on thugs. Those are two different ways to say a similar thing, but that have very different effects. And one could be more appealing in ads and take over. And if you don't, and if that subtlety is not, if that change, which is more than a subtle change, is missed by a single unified definition of an ad, I think there would be a loss there. Now, there may be reasons, countervailing reasons, simplicity in actually complying with this for candidates that may outweigh that, but I just want to throw that out as something that could be important that could be lost.
Thank you. Other task force members have comments on this issue? All right. Along these lines, the next question I wanted the task force to consider a little bit more specifically is what types of, I'm just going to put quotes around it, targeting information do task force members think is important in terms of disclosure? If any, perhaps nobody thinks it's important.
This is Amber again. I actually have some concern about requiring targeting information as a part of this, and just sort of big picture, targeting is not new to digital advertisements. Targeting has been done by campaigns forever, and targeting is done based on the voters that the campaign thinks will vote for that issue or that candidate. I think of targeting as more of a resource allocation issue. Campaign funds are limited, and so where are we going to spend our money? It's going to be to voters who we know will vote for our candidate or our issue. I don't think of it as this nefarious thing, and it's done whether you're talking to voters at their door, whether you're talking to voters doing a phone bank, a volunteer phone bank. Targeting comes into play to however you're communicating with your voters. So I don't know that it informs the electorate with meaningful information about who's paying to influence elections to ask campaigns to divulge what I think of as internal campaign strategy, almost the equivalent of a trade secret.
All right, thank you. Do other folks have reaction to that?
So if we're going to talk about accountability, right, and counter speech and these sorts of things, and it sounds like that's at least on the list of the state interests here, I also don't think we need the targeting criteria. I think we need the ability to reach the same audience. And so you can, if if you think that an ad that was run was unfair to you, or whatever, if you just want to reach the same audience, right, then you should be able to do that without even knowing who they are. And I don't think we should allow any targeting within that group, right? So if we see the targeting criteria as, what did I say earlier, like all women between the ages of 40 and 55 in California, then we're able to say, well, I actually, if it went to the women between ages 40 and 55, I really just want to target the women in, Southern California that are slightly older or whatever, right? It allows us to target within the other campaigns targets. But if we just, if the point is accountability, right, then you don't need to know their strategy. You just need to be able to reach those same people. And so a lot of times we talk about this in terms of revealing targets. And if you're thinking about it in terms of like accounting and transparency and where the money went, if the money was spent, on this is, I know that the state of Washington does it this way. They think like, well, this was part of the service that you paid for. And so we want to know what the targets were. That's different than talking about accountability for, the content of your speech and allowing other people to reach the same people. So there's kind of two different interests at play, but one might be a little friendlier to the campaign world, right? Because then we're not revealing, they don't feel like they're revealing strategy at all.
What would the difference in terms of the information subject to disclosure be based on the two different interests you just articulated? One being accountability in the sense that I want to reach the same audience. The other, it being, well, look, this is something you're paying for, so we have a right as the state to know what you're paying for. So isn't it the same information fundamentally?
Well, I think the way that Washington does it, the way they talked about it is like, if you pay the platform, they're only capturing part of the targeting. If you pay the platform to target this group, then that's part of the purchase that you make with the platform. And so therefore they feel like that's part of what they get to see. What I'm saying is that if it's really about accountability for your speech, then the other side doesn't need to know who you targeted. They just need to be able to reach the same audience. So it's really two different, this is why I got so excited about what Professor Kauser said at the start, right? It's two different motivations, right? Lead us to two different kind of approaches to getting to gaining the ability to speak to the same people.
Okay, thank you. Other task force members want to speak on this issue? So Professor Wood, I want to go back to you then, because I thought that it's an interesting, my question is, if the interest that you're articulating is that we want to, is from a counter speech perspective, is we want to be able to reach the same audience, then what is specifically now, what is the information and who would provide it that we're looking for here?
So this is what gets complicated, I think, when the state's involved, because when I've been writing all this, I've been saying, look, the platforms can do this, right? The state could require that the platforms do it, but the platform, I mean, in my mind, I'm not a platform person, but like they would provide a link, and then push this, and then you'll have access to all these people that, your opponent ran the ad about, or that, that you're whatever, like you just have access to the people that saw this ad. And you may not have enough money to reach all of them, and then there's some decisions that have to be made within that. But anyway, so my thinking on this is that we need to be able to reach the same audience. I'm not sure how that works when it's in the government database. Maybe it's a link to, the audience that goes straight through to the platform or something. But I don't know. Like I'm out of my depth. Once we get to the technology of how it all works, I'm out of my depth. But when we're talking about the kind of democracy related reasons for doing it, I'm, able to at least articulate that.
So I think it just might be useful to state that at least for Google, what the targeting, restricted targeting for election ads are, and it's geographic location, it's age and gender, and contextualizing targeting options, ad placements, keywords, that kind of thing. So when we're talking about the same audience, and to your point, to the points that made earlier around the varying aspects of these ads being run, it just, I think it gets a bit complex to kind of say, okay, this was, again, kind of using the television ad example, saying this was run at this time on this station. It's just a different kind of computation. But I wanted to, kind of get at the kind of demystify what the actual targeting criteria is, because it's not an endless list of criteria, and there's a number of criteria that are restricted and forbidden on our platform, at least.
This is James Schwab. Doesn't seem like we're approaching this, but just as an FYI, in terms of disclosing targeting, if it gets down to disclosing targeting based on the voter file that they receive from our office, there is prohibitions around sharing that information, sharing the voter file with other entities. If you were a campaign and you got that voter file, there's prohibitions around sharing it with other entities. So I don't think we're going in that direction, but just sort of a FYI.
Yeah, it's a good reminder. Thanks, James.
This is Jennifer.
So Ms. Davis, can I ask a question, Ms. Davis? So having heard what Professor Wood, I will just say in a perfect world, would like to be able to do in terms of counter speech, is that even possible from a platform like Google? Is it possible that I came, my opponent ran an ad on Google, and they reached a certain audience based on your algorithms and your AI, and I say, hey, look, what they said was all wrong. I want to speak right to those same folks. Is it even possible that I could do that technologically?
From my understanding, no, but I would need to check with my colleagues, just in terms of the permutations and the sheer, vast number, depending on campaign. I don't believe so.
Okay, thank you.
And if someone runs an advertisement targeting a certain demographic, would you even know how many of those people actually were, saw that advertisement?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's just because an advertisement runs, you could be up, getting yourself a snack during your Zoom meeting and not notice, that there's been an advertisement run in the background. So, running it, and I think that's a, difficulty of all ads, but particularly with digital and online ads as well.
I think another challenge with the counter speech approach is that all candidates or campaigns would have to be similarly situated in terms of funding. So if your opponent is well funded and you're not, and even if you have the information, you need the campaign funds to turn around and reach those voters, and that won't always be the case. And if there is an 11th hour hit, election eve hit, then there wouldn't be time to respond anyway. So I think those are some challenges as well.
Ms. Davis, I was interested in your comment that there's certain criteria that you can use to target people, such as I think you said age, location, etc. But there's certain things that you do not. Do you have sort of a public list or one that you could share of things that you would not target on? And also, I'm curious if if other, Facebook, Twitter, other platforms like that, if they also have that same kind of list, if you know.
So I can't speak for other platforms, but I'm sure that they'd be able to provide some information to that end. It literally is everything outside of those criteria that I just listed. So anything else that you can kind of dream up to target outside of those criteria is not permitted.
Thank you.
Going back to an earlier comment, I just wanted to say that I'm not sure that the targeting information is as innocent or I think it's very relevant in some cases as to how to interpret an ad, particularly when you look at misinformation ads. So knowing that the target audience was perhaps not who you would have expected. So if you think about an ad that's like, okay, I want to support a member of the Green Party, and it goes to people who are known to live in an environmental area or, have liked the Sierra Club on Facebook or whatever it is, if you actually see the ads that are used to identify people who are easily inflamed, where you actually run an ad that you think those people will hate. You then create a list from that group of people who responded, and then you do a totally different ad to them because you know that they will be passionate against that. And I've purchased ads like that myself. And so knowing that there was this ad that was actually going to people who would hate that ad is very different than knowing the ad went to people who would love that ad. And so I'm not, how that can be an important information for your campaign and strategy. And I don't know how to get around that, but I don't want to say that that targeting isn't super relevant to how you interpret what that ad was doing and why a voter might want to know.
That's super interesting. I'm glad you said that.
That's a good point. So, Ms. Davis, I just want to make sure I understand something. I'm going back over my notes here. So when an entity wants to run a political ad on Google, there's a menu of different criteria. We'll call it targeting criteria, and you've ticked those off for us. Do they have to I assume, it sounds like a silly question, but I assume they have to tell you when they're submitting that ad, I want you to use geography, age, and gender, and these are the ranges that we want you to use. Is that true? They actually communicate that information to you as part of the process?
Yeah, so that's in order to run their ads, they would need to kind of identify those spheres that they want to target. In terms of our records of that and how directly it's communicated to Google actual employees, I would imagine it's much more of an automated process in terms of kind of not working directly on those fronts. But again, happy to investigate and get back to you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
I have a question too, Ms. Davis. Can they can also give you a list of people to target? I know they do that on Facebook. Because then it's generated offline. Oh no, okay.
No. There's not a list of people. I think it's just inherent difference in the platforms. So it's not Rena Davis of Oakland that we want to target.
Okay. So because this is helpful to think about too, right? So if we do go down the road of requiring targeting criteria, then I wish we had Facebook here, right? They will also just receive a list that a group wants to target, and therefore there won't be any targeting criteria that's associated with a transaction that happens with the platform. And so that's another kind of nice elegance of being able to just reach the audience itself, is you kind of get around circumvention, right? But people just deciding to generate the list offline so they can avoid having to reveal who their targets were. Because I do know that is something that happens on Facebook.
And I think just in general, as we're moving through this topic, that kind of I would caution against making it a foregone conclusion for us to place that burden on the platforms to supply this information. And I think that we should definitely be considering a number of different avenues to populating the database, be it through our transparency reports, some semblance of requirements placed on the actual folks who are running the ads. I do think that's important to have a deeper conversation on, just because it can impact the availability and also who may want to kind of disclose their own activities to the points that were made earlier on social media.
Great,
let's
thank
throw
you.
one possible thing. I'd love feedback from campaign professionals and others about whether it's a legitimate concern. So we've been thinking of, a set of anti-circumvention goals that would be that a certain set of reporting requirements might further, and then this counter speech goal that targeting might require. And the question is, would targeting actually make some circumvention easier? So one circumvention that people have been worried about for a long time is independent expenditures, outside spending, coordinating with campaigns. One way that they do that is, I've talked to people who run IEs and they say, well, we just go to the candidate's website and figure out what their message is. So they're using internet sources to essentially coordinate legally. One thing might be is, if I'm running an IE and I want to help this candidate, I just look at exactly who they're targeting and then I target those people. So whatever the targeting disclosure is, the more specific it is, it could be helping counter speech, but it could be helping those groups double down on their speech by sort of feeding them an avenue to circumvent anti-coordination requirements. Is that a legitimate concern?
I mean, if none of the campaign professionals are going to speak, I'll just say that there's already so many ways to coordinate under the exceptions that I don't even know if they need this additional one. I don't know if it's going to help much.
Fair.
Interesting question, though. All right. Is there anything, I think this has been a very good conversation on the targeting information. And just Ms. Davis in particular, I just want to thank you for helping us understand how your platform processes the information. And I would love to hear from your colleagues at perhaps our next meeting, get a little bit more granular on that issue if we can. And,
Yeah, I'd
by
love
the
to
way,
bring them along.
I just want to give some kudos to your organization for the work that they've done on their own, creating the Transparency Archive and working on that. It's great stuff. So thank you.
Thank you, and I know that my colleagues are eager to join and have a little bit of conversation with y'all themselves. So look forward to scheduling that for a future meeting.
Great. All right. Well, unless there's additional comment on the types of information, I'm mindful that we went way over the time last time, so we're going to keep it to 2 hours today. So we have a little bit less than a half an hour left. So let's go ahead and move on to the question. We sort of touched on this, but folks may have additional comments. Who should be responsible for providing the information maintained in the archive? To my mind, I think at a minimum, it's going to be the campaigns. I think there's really no way to get around that. The question is what and to what extent, if any, do we have additional inputs from the online platforms? But what do other task force members think about that?
Did someone else want to say something? Mr. Schwab, are you?
No, you got it, Ms.
Oh, okay. So once again, just going back to these government code sections, 845.04 point, I guess it's point 3 through point 6. So those are all the government code sections that just went into effect in January, and they talk about the disclosures that come from the online platform. So in addition to campaigns disclosing it, if online platforms are already collecting these, I would think that one option would be to add a link or have the, just the online platform just download it, or there's be a link between the government and what is already there. It won't cost, I think, people more, but it just makes sure maybe that there's a more robust database.
Great, thank you for that. Do other task force members have additional comments on this?
Yeah, I'd be interested to just know if there's, I think, our transparency report is very comprehensive, but would love to give some thought, perhaps not in this meeting, but in the future, to how, the existing tools that are provided by companies can be leveraged, for government use, so that there's less need to ask and kind of get those things, especially prepared, especially when, at least for us, that they're already being built to be extremely comprehensive. So I'd love to think about that. Either if it's, even if we are rising above that standard, that, there is, a baseline that most platforms can meet.
Yeah, that's a good point. It raises an issue though, Ms. Davis, and again, I want to say, I think Google has done a fantastic job on this. The linkage between, let's say, a state-run archive, though, and a privately held database that the government doesn't control or have any assurances of integrity in terms of the information in, it's only as good as it is that it's there. And if there is no requirement that you keep it or maintain it, or what goes in and what goes out, So I just sort of put that out there. It's good that we have it today and we can talk about that, but if we were to totally rely on the goodwill of the platforms, and then those platforms decided not to do that anymore, what do we do at that point? I mean, it's more of a big picture question, but I am concerned with being overly reliant on that type of a model when the input could go away tomorrow and there's nothing we can do about it.
No, I understand, and I think that's, to your initial point around the burden, or at least the campaigns being the first, source of this information is the appropriate, kind of cadence to this, and using this as kind of a supplement. I think, from my understanding, at least, there would be additional legislation that would, be required for, some sort of compliance on that end. But again, I think that if you're talking about, a base level that exists within kind of an industry standard already, that there might be, an ability to at least give, again, because there are some platforms that are not going to have as comprehensive a database as ours, but giving at least that kind of that base level that folks could meet, and then potentially exceed if they have the resources and see fit. Then that might be something to move forward on. Again, I forget who it was that made the point earlier around the budget, but I thought that was a really good one. As we, think about how this is going to function moving forward, there are constraints that are, out of anyone's control, given, the crisis that we find ourselves in, and what, if you look at the governor's budget, his May revise, a number of things were cut back, which were very difficult, I'm sure. So to, see how, the funding can be used efficiently, and perhaps, start, at one point and get to another point, later on once the recovery has, is well underway and folks have their feet back under them.
Good point.
Jennifer Wagner from the League of Women Voters again. I had a really interesting conversation with a couple of different very small ad buyers who find using ad buying systems very laborious and kind of overwhelming, particularly if they run anything on federal campaigns across multiple states where there's all these different regulations by the states and they get really confused. And so they're very dependent upon the platforms actually queuing to them what they're required to do, because sometimes they're small grassroots groups that just want to show their support and they get caught up in whether they're buying a campaign ad or not. So the idea that the platform could actually facilitate a lot of the smaller groups still being able to participate. One of them explained it as sort of being like they would pay extra for insurance if the platform would just say like, okay, these are the things you need to do to run this ad in California, file all these things. But what one of them said is, they've been doing that for some of their ads, and that they found it such a laborious process with Facebook that it was kind of disturbing. They said they'd rather give their driver's license and a copy of their home address to the state than to Facebook. And so as we think about who holds what responsibility where, and as products are built out potentially where maybe someone doesn't have to have the platform report it, but the platform maybe is facilitating that, is that a good thing? Can the platform require them to do that through them, or can it be done through the state for them to get around some of that? I thought these were really interesting questions that I hadn't really considered before. So there's, who's responsible for it, but then how do products get built in to help with that? And I just thought it was a neat point for them to make.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to to put a platform in the place of regulating and scoping in. It's impossible for us to know who actually is who needs to be disclosing these things based on certain criteria within the laws. So I do think that it's interesting to hear them say that they'd rather give it to the government. I think there's a lot of people that probably feel that way. But and I do think that for this particular instance, it makes sense given the subject matter that we're talking about, that those kinds of things would be handed over to the government versus these other entities, and then kind of able to be shared under existing law and regulatory standards.
Yeah, Ms. Wagner, if the comment and the experience of the smaller groups you've been talking to is that they're finding it problematic to comply with the commission's regulations and the statutes. I think that's good information for us to know, because part of our job, of course, is pushing out education and outreach so we can help people understand what the rules are. Because I agree with Ms. Davis, it's certainly not the platform's job to help folks comply with the Political Reform Act. That's our job. So I'm sure we'll be taking a look at that to the extent that's an area of concern for us. All right, anything else on item D? Because if not, in our remaining time, maybe we can talk for a few minutes about search capabilities and then other issues that task force members may be interested in that we could schedule for future meetings. So search capabilities. Folks have particular thoughts on specific search capabilities that we want the archive to have. Anybody?
Well, I guess I'd like to know what's being considered, because I would assume we would just want it all to be searchable. So I guess I'm a little confused by the question, but maybe that's because I want to see all this stuff. I want all the data, you know.
No, that's it's a fair point. It's written as a broad question. I have the benefit of, I went to Washington State when the Washington Public Disclosure Commission did their symposium a while back, and one of the things that some researchers talked about were different private databases that they've experienced and different public databases they've experienced. Some of them will allow you to aggregate the information, for example, and sort of cross-search across different elections, et cetera, so you can you sort of see where they're getting at. They're trying to identify trends, for example, as opposed to, here's our archive. If you want to know what's being run in Senate District 5, I'm going to tell you everything that's run in Senate District 5, but you're not going to be able to pull, 4 elections and aggregate the data and sort of slice and dice it in different ways. At least that functionality wouldn't be built in on the front end. So that's, and by the way, I'm not a very technical person, certainly not a researcher, but that was the general sense I got from the researchers, was they've had different experiences, and so I thought it'd be good for us to, what is the ideal for us?
I think from my perspective, from the thinking about both the research realm, but also the normal voters and journalists that I think are probably the prime audiences for this, having open API, with a combination of open API, which, I think so any researcher is just going to want to pull it all themselves and do it all themselves, but many normal citizens aren't, right? They're going to want to be able to create something. So a combination of, so you have the open API, which is relatively easy and not costly to construct. But then I think having some resources, and this may have to wait till the state has more resources, but having some resources to create a very usable website. And I love particularly the input of the Secretary of State's office, that moving from a website, taking down a website created by their predecessors that was the least effective website anywhere ever in how to deal with data, and trying to create a version of it that I think is now, is something that's very useful to voters. What's involved in that? Is this, how expensive is this? But I think having a useful website as well as the open API would be a great goal.
Great. Other comments on this? All right.
Yeah, I guess just one other thing is, like, one way to maybe do it on the cheap, at least for now, would be to be in tight communication with groups that would be able to put kind of widgets and stuff on top of it, where it wouldn't get hosted on the .gov or .ca.gov or whatever it is, but where they could kind of pull from it, like MapLight might just pull straight from the API and be able to mess around with it, kind of like with Open Secrets, right, or followthemoney.org. Where they could, help digest it and show it in different configurations people might be interested in. I mean, in theory, it would be nice to have that on the government site, but I don't think even FEC does a lot of that, so.
Okay. All right, any other comments on search capabilities? All right. What other issues do task force members have that they would like to see presented, let's just say the next 2 meetings? and it could be related to the topics that we talked about today. It could be other issues. I know one thing I'm interested in are disclaimers, the format of disclaimers that we use in digital advertisement, standardizing those, perhaps making them a little bit more user-friendly, things of that nature. But what about other task force members? What are the things that you guys like to see information about and talk about?
I think that both Google and Facebook are both such big platforms that people use a lot, but that I also would like to know a lot more about sort of the future of apps and how digital ads are being used there, how they're going to be tracked, who's placing them. And part of that could be a discussion of sort of the larger ad marketplace and how complicated it really is. So that as we think about like tracking IDs and the future of ads, we would understand a little bit more about where in-app advertising is going.
Ms. Wagner, I think you had mentioned before that you had worked for an app in some prior time or familiar with them. Do you have somebody in mind or a group in mind that might be a good candidate to come talk to us and walk through those issues?
There's a couple of ad associations where I've been given names of people to reach out to, but I haven't been able to connect with them yet. I actually think that Google probably knows a lot about this, so it's possible that some of Rena's colleagues might be able to speak to it.
All right, thanks.
I think for informational purposes, because it's in this realm, understanding the status of sort of the deep fake advertisement world. I know there's been some movement by social media companies to ban them, but there's a lot of chatter in our end of the world in elections around potential abuse and use of that in this November. So I think maybe for the benefit of the group and maybe to generate ideas, have a discussion, and maybe find an expert to come speak to us about deep fakes and what it means for all of our work.
That's a great idea. Do you have somebody in mind, or just?
My staff does, and I'll check in with my staff. They've been doing the research.
And also, Stanford did a report last June. The CDRL did a report about the deep foreign interference from that perspective. So there's a number of authors. Some of them are political scientists, but there's also some of them are more on the, the technical side too. So I can send you a copy of that report if that would be helpful, Mr. Chair.
Yes, that'd be great, and then we can post it on our task force website so everybody can access it as well.
If we're going to talk about design for disclosures, I really want to recommend the Center for Civic Design. I think having actual designers who are experts in voter information would be fantastic to have speak, and they're great. It's the Center for Civic Design.
Great, thank you. Any other comments, issues that task force members would like to see brought to the table at future meetings?
This is Amber Maltby. I just want to second the earlier comments about bringing in somebody or talking about the challenge, the changing digital ad marketplace, but also what digital ads will look like over the next year, 2 year, going into the next big election cycle. I think that will be an important conversation for when and if we talk about disclaimers. From my perspective, my firm advises campaigns on how to comply with the disclaimer requirements, and there's a disconnect between the digital ads that the campaigns are operating with and the disclaimer rules, and how they don't always match, or the digital ads far outpace the disclaimer rules. So I think having a clear connection between what the digital marketplace is will be really important to help us inform any recommendations we make about future disclaimer requirements.
That's a great point. All right, we'll add that to the list. All right. Any other task force members have comments, questions, anything that they would like for the good of the order, as we say?
Yeah, I mean, so one idea here is we've heard public comments from the Brennan Center campaign, legal center, great folks who are on the side, who are always on one side of these legal cases, right? And, I think it would also be important to invite in, who do you think's going to sue you over this? Basically, like, think about what what people who take a more free speech orientation to campaign finance have, and have them on the agenda and get to hear what their thoughts are. I think I think this, having a breadth of opinion early on is always important.
Yep, good point. Good point. Any other Commissioner Hayward?
I think Thad is suggesting I go call my friends.
That's how I took that as well.
I knew.
Call
Seriously.
Amber.
I mean, in all seriousness, I think, so much of what the sort of deregulatory or regulatory skeptic side has been focused on through the years has been things like prohibitions, privacy, and a general opposition to using public resources or public funding things. I'm not sure that this is something that there's a view on, but maybe that's healthy. I mean, maybe we should get 3 or 4 people from my side of the pond and see if they agree about anything. That could be that could be quite enlightening.
All right, thank you. All right, you guys. Well, we went long last time, so we're 10 minutes early this time. So unless anyone has anything else they wish to bring to the table, I would move that we adjourn. Somebody second that. We'll just do a roll call vote and we can move on. All right, second. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none. All right, you guys, have a great weekend. Thank you very much, and we'll be in touch about our next meeting. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.